Welcome back to Quiet History by Song. Tonight, we travel back to the Pacific in the years before the United States entered the Second World War. The sun had risen over the island of Oahu. Ships rested in the harbor. Many sailors were eating breakfast, preparing for church, or enjoying a few peaceful hours away from duty. Far beyond the horizon, however, events were already in motion that would change the course of history. Japanese aircraft were approaching Hawaii. Within hours, Pearl Harbor would become one of the most famous places associated with the Second World War. But tonight, rather than focusing on the attack itself, we will ask a more complicated question. Why did Japan decide to attack the United States at all? Japan's leaders knew that America possessed enormous industrial resources. They understood that a long war with the United States could be extremely dangerous. And yet, in late 1941, they chose to take that risk. To understand why, we must travel back several years before Pearl Harbor, to a time when Japan was seeking greater influence across East Asia, while tensions with the United States were slowly beginning to rise. So find a comfortable place to rest. Let the day become quiet around you, and let us begin. By the early 20th century, Japan had transformed itself dramatically. Only a few generations earlier, it had been largely isolated from much of the outside world. After the Meiji Restoration beginning in 1868, however, Japan modernized with remarkable speed. Railways appeared, factories expanded, a modern army and navy were created. New schools and institutions helped transform the country into a major industrial power. Japan also began building an empire. It gained control over Taiwan following its war with China in the 1890s. After defeating Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, Japan emerged as a major military power. In 1910, Korea was formally annexed into the Japanese Empire. By the 1930s, Japanese influence had expanded further into northeastern China. But Japan faced a fundamental problem. Its growing industrial economy required enormous quantities of natural resources. Oil, iron, rubber, coal, and other raw materials were essential for factories, ships, aircraft, transportation, and military operations. Japan could produce some of these resources itself, but not nearly enough. It depended heavily on imports. And one of the most important suppliers was the United States. For years, American business sold Japan oil, metals, machinery, and other materials. That relationship worked while the two countries remained at peace. But Japan's expanding military ambitions in Asia were gradually making that relationship more difficult. In 1937, fighting between Japan and China expanded into a major war. Japanese forces captured important cities and occupied large areas, but Chinese resistance continued. Instead of ending quickly, the conflict became long and expensive. Japan needed increasing quantities of fuel, metal, and other resources to maintain its military operations. American leaders watched these developments with growing concern. The United States had important economic and political relationships with China. Washington increasingly opposed Japanese expansion there, although American leaders were initially reluctant to enter a war over the issue. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration gradually began placing restrictions on exports that could support Japan's military. At the same time, the United States increased assistance to China. The relationship between Washington and Tokyo slowly deteriorated. Yet neither country initially wanted a direct war with the other. Japan still depended heavily on international trade, and the United States was already watching an enormous war unfolding in Europe. For both governments, avoiding another major conflict remained desirable, but their goals in Asia were becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile. By 1940, Europe had been transformed by war. Germany had defeated France. The Netherlands had been occupied. Britain was fighting for survival. To Japanese strategists, the European crisis created both danger and opportunity. European colonial possessions in Southeast Asia contained many of the resources Japan needed. The Netherlands East Indies, today largely Indonesia, possessed valuable oil supplies. British-controlled territories contained rubber and other resources. French Indochina occupied an important strategic position close to China and Southeast Asia. Japanese leaders increasingly considered moving south. In September 1940, Japan also signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy. The agreement strengthened American fears that the conflicts in Europe and Asia were becoming connected. Japan then increased its presence in French Indochina. From Tokyo's perspective, these moves were part of a larger strategy to secure Japan's position in Asia and reduce its dependence on Western powers. From Washington's perspective, however, Japan appeared to be continuing a dangerous campaign of expansion. Each side increasingly viewed the other's actions as a threat. And then came the issue that would transform the crisis. Oil. Modern military power depended on petroleum. Warships needed fuel. Aircraft needed fuel. Trucks needed fuel. Factories and transportation networks depended upon reliable energy supplies. Japan imported much of the petroleum it consumed, and the United States had been one of its most important suppliers. American policymakers understood the significance of this dependence. They also understood the danger of restricting oil exports too quickly. Internal U.S. government discussions in 1941 recognized that severe restrictions could encourage Japan to seize oil-producing territories in Southeast Asia by force. In other words, Washington knew economic pressure carried risks. Office of the Historian. Nevertheless, tensions continued rising. When Japan moved further into French Indochina in July 1941, the United States froze Japanese assets. Britain and the Netherlands took similar measures. The practical result was a severe restriction on Japan's ability to obtain oil and other essential materials. For Japanese leaders, this created a strategic crisis. Their existing reserves would not last forever. If they abandoned their military expansion, they might restore access to international trade. But doing so would mean giving up goals that Japan had pursued at enormous cost. Another possibility was to seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, but that presented another problem. The United States had important military forces in the Pacific, particularly in the Philippines and Hawaii. Japanese leaders feared that if they moved south toward the Netherlands, East Indies, and British territories, the United States might intervene. Japan now faced a narrowing set of choices: retreat, negotiate, or prepare for war. Even while military preparation continued, diplomats from Japan and the United States spent much of 1941 trying to find a compromise. Japan's ambassador in Washington, Kichisaburo Nomura, held repeated discussions with U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull. The negotiations were complicated. Japan wanted economic restrictions eased and greater freedom to pursue its policies in Asia. The United States wanted Japan to limit or reverse its expansion, particularly in China and Indochina. Neither government found the other's conditions acceptable. This did not mean that everyone had already decided upon war. Documents from the period show that negotiations continued for months, and both sides explored possible agreements. But time was becoming increasingly important. Japan's leaders knew their resource situation would worsen if the restrictions continued. Meanwhile, military planners were preparing alternatives in case diplomacy failed. By late 1941, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo hated the Japanese government. Japan continued negotiations with Washington, but behind those negotiations, preparations for a much larger Pacific conflict were advancing. One of the plans involved a place thousands of miles away from Japan, A quiet harbor in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor. If Japan's primary objective was gaining access to resources in Southeast Asia, why attack Hawaii? The answer was the United States Pacific Fleet. Pearl Harbor had become the fleet's principal base in Hawaii. Japanese planners feared that American naval forces could interfere with Japan's planned expansion into Southeast Asia. The strategy that emerged was extraordinarily risky. Japan would strike American forces at Pearl Harbor while simultaneously launching operations across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The hope was to weaken American naval power long enough for Japan to secure a broad defensive perimeter and capture the resources it needed. Japanese leaders hoped that after suffering heavy initial losses, the United States might eventually accept a negotiated settlement rather than fight a long and costly war across the Pacific. This assumption would prove disastrously wrong. America possessed enormous industrial capacity, and instead of destroying American willingness to fight, Pearl Harbor would help unite a previously divided public behind war. But in late 1941, Japan's leaders could not know exactly how events would unfold. They were making decisions based on estimates, assumptions, and fears about the future. The attack plan itself had been under serious study for months, and Japanese naval forces trained extensively for the operation. Historical records indicate that planning was underway by early 1941. By November, diplomacy was approaching its final stage, and the Japanese strike force was preparing to sail. On November 26, 1941, the Japanese carrier force departed its assembly area in the northern Pacific and began moving toward Hawaii. The voyage was conducted under strict secrecy. At almost the same time, negotiation in Washington reached a critical point. The United States presented Japan with proposals calling for major changes in Japanese policy, including withdrawal from China and Indochina. Tokyo considered these terms unacceptable. The possibility of compromise was rapidly disappearing. Yet conversations between the two governments continued even as Japanese ships crossed the Pacific. This created one of the most remarkable contrasts in the history of diplomacy. In Washington, diplomats continued discussing peace. Across the ocean, a naval force was quietly approaching Hawaii. By early December, the final decision had been made. The operation would proceed. December 7th, 1941, began peacefully in Hawaii. Just before 8 o'clock in the morning, Japanese aircraft reached Pearl Harbor. The attack came as a profound surprise. American battleships, aircraft, and other military facilities were struck during 2 waves of attacks. The damage was severe. More than 2,400 Americans were killed, and many more were wounded. Numerous ships and aircraft were destroyed or damaged. Japan lost 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines, but the attack was only part of a much larger Japanese offensive. Japanese forces also moved against other American, British, and Allied positions across Asia and the Pacific. The war that Japan's leaders hoped might secure their strategic position had begun, and their calculation about America's response would soon be tested. News of Pearl Harbor spread rapidly across the United States. For years, Americans had debated how deeply their country should become involved in the Second World War. Pearl Harbor transformed that debate almost overnight. On December 8th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress. He described the previous day as a date that would be remembered in infamy and asked Congress to recognize that a state of war existed between the United States and Japan. Congress approved the declaration overwhelmingly. Only one member voted against it. The United States was now formally at war with Japan. Several days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States as well. America had entered the Second World War fully in both the Pacific and European theaters. So, why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor? There was no single reason. The answer developed over years. Japan's expansion in China created growing tension with the United States. Its ambitions in Southeast Asia increased those tensions further. American economic restrictions, especially those affecting oil, placed enormous pressure on a country heavily dependent on imported resources. Diplomatic negotiations failed to resolve the fundamental disagreement, and Japanese leaders ultimately decided that securing their strategic objectives by force was preferable to abandoning their expansion. Pearl Harbor was intended to reduce America's ability to interfere. Instead, it produced almost the opposite result. It brought the United States directly into the war and mobilized American industrial and military power on an enormous scale. It is one of history's clearest reminders that governments make decisions without knowing their ultimate consequences. The people making those decisions can calculate, they can plan, they can predict, but they cannot see the future. And sometimes an action intended to solve one problem creates another far greater than anyone expected. Thank you for joining me on this quiet journey through history. Tonight, we followed the long road from rising tensions in East Asia to that Sunday morning in December 1941. Until our next journey, rest well, sleep peacefully, and thank you for listening to Quiet History by Song.